A 4-year-old girl picks up a gold cufflink and smiles at the wrong woman. And in 30 seconds, a Korean mafia boss discovers the secret that changes everything. Admit, if this story pulls you in from the very first scene, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let's see how far this story travels. Your city keeps me writing. Now, let's begin. The cufflink hit the marble floor at 7:14 in the morning. Nobody saw it fall. Nobody was supposed to be in that corridor at that hour. Not the staff, not the guards rotating shift in the East Wing, certainly not a 4-year-old girl in yellow socks padding silently down the hallway with a worn stuffed rabbit tucked under her left arm. But Zuri Johnson had her mother's eyes, watchful, catching everything, and when the tiny disk of gold caught the winter light bleeding through the tall windows, she stopped the way small children stop for beautiful things, without calculation, without any idea of what it meant or who it belonged to. She just crouched down on the cold marble, picked it up with 2 careful fingers, and turned it in the pale morning light. It was heavy, heavier than anything that small should be. The face of it was engraved, something angular, something serious, and it caught the gray soul winter the way expensive things always catch light, with an arrogance that doesn't need an audience. Zuri didn't know any of that. She just knew it was pretty. She closed her fist around it, stood up in her yellow socks, and went looking for her mother. She didn't find her mother. She found Yoon Seo-ah instead. Seo-ah had arrived the evening before. Her luggage, 12 pieces, all matching, all in a shade of ivory that announced money without needing to announce itself, had been carried upstairs by 3 members of the household staff while she stood in the entrance hall and looked at the estate the way a woman looks at a property she has already decided to redecorate. She was 31, beautiful in that specific architectural way that certain Korean women carry beauty, like a structure built to last, maintained with discipline, not sentiment. Her engagement to Kang Min-jae had been announced 8 months earlier. The date had been discussed. The families had been satisfied. The future had been arranged. She had come to settle in. She came down the main staircase that morning at 7:16, dressed already, heeled shoes on marble, a phone in one hand and the clipped energy of a woman running a timetable in her head. She turned into the east corridor and nearly walked into a child. She stopped. The child looked up at her. There was a pause, 3, maybe 4 seconds, in which the whole house seemed to hold its breath. The winter light came flat through the tall windows. Somewhere in the kitchen wing, something metallic shifted on a stovetop. One of the guards at the end of the corridor stood very still. Zuri opened her fist. The gold cufflink sat in her small palm. She held it up toward the woman in front of her with a smile that had never in its 4 years of existence done anything except try to be kind. Seo-ah looked at the cufflink, then at the child, then at the rabbit under the child's arm, then back at the child's face. Round, dark-skinned, enormous brown eyes, a gap where a milk tooth had recently fallen out. Something moved behind Seo-ah's face, something that came and went too fast to name. Then she said it. "Get out of this house." Dam. The words fell through the corridor the way cold water falls, without drama, without raised volume, which somehow made it worse. A scream would have been containable. This was not a scream. It was a verdict. Zuri's smile disappeared. The cufflink dropped from her open hand. It hit the marble with a sound that was very small and very loud at the same time. A precise metallic note that rang once and then died, and the silence that followed it was enormous. The guard at the end of the corridor turned his face away. The kitchen noise stopped. Zuri looked down at the cufflink on the floor. Her lower lip moved. She pulled the stuffed rabbit tighter under her arm. That automatic gesture of a child reaching for the one thing that never changes on her. And her eyes went glassy, but she did not cry. Not yet. She was 4 years old and she had been taught, without anyone ever meaning to teach her, that she needed to be careful in this house, that she was tolerated, that her presence was a privilege that could be revoked. She had never understood why until this moment. Now she understood exactly why. Amara Johnson appeared at the far end of the corridor 30 seconds later, moving fast with a cleaning caddy in one hand and a dish towel still tucked in her apron. The specific hurry of a woman who runs this kind of tight because she has to, because there is no margin for error in a life structured entirely around not making errors. She saw her daughter standing frozen in the middle of the hallway. She saw the woman in heels. She saw the cufflink on the floor. She stopped moving. The caddy bumped against her hip and stilled. For a moment, she could not locate her voice. It was there somewhere. She was certain of it. But the part of her brain that produced words had gone offline, replaced entirely by a hot, terrible calculus. Her child, that woman, this house, the 4 years she had spent making herself invisible, making Zuri invisible, shrinking and folding and pressing herself flat so that nothing she was would ever take up too much space in a place where space was not hers to take. And she thought, I should apologize. The thought came automatically, reflexively, the way all the bad conditioning comes, fast and first, before dignity can get a word in. Then she looked at her daughter's face, at the rabbit held so tight the stuffing was compressing, at the glassy eyes that were still, somehow, not crying, and the apology died before it reached her mouth. She was still standing there, unable to speak, when she heard the footsteps, not the quick, soft steps of house staff, not the measured, professional tread of the rotating guards. These were slow, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who moves at his own pace because the world adjusts to him, not the other way around. From the second-floor landing, descending the main staircase without urgency, without any visible awareness that the temperature in the east corridor had dropped to something uninhabitable, Kang Min-jae was coming downstairs. He was tall, 34 years old, with a face that had been constructed over decades for the specific purpose of giving nothing away. He was still buttoning the cuff of his left sleeve, the right cuff already closed, which meant he had been looking for something this morning and had not yet found it. He wore no expression when he reached the foot of the stairs and looked into the corridor. Just that flat, watchful stillness that people in his world learned early to fear more than any raised voice. He took in the scene without any visible reaction. The woman in heels, the child, the cufflink on the floor. Amara frozen at the far end. He descended the last step. He walked the length of the corridor, and then Kang Min-jae, the man who had ordered the dismantlement of 3 rival criminal networks in 18 months, the man whose name made senior figures in Seoul's underworld choose their words carefully, crouched down on the marble floor in front of a 4-year-old girl in yellow socks and picked up the fallen cufflink. He turned it once in his fingers. Then he held it out toward Zuri. She stared at him, not moving. The rabbit clutched against her chest, both small arms wrapped around it now. He waited. After a long moment, she reached out with one hand and took it from him. Her fingers brushed his palm in the exchange, brief, light, accidental, and something moved across Min-jae's face so quickly that nobody in the corridor could have named it. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by the usual stillness. He straightened up. He faced Seo-ah. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet. Amara and Zuri are not leaving. Seo-ah's composure was exceptional. She had been raised to maintain composure. Her mother had been raised to maintain composure. It was a generational inheritance, that particular brand of elegant Korean upper-class control, the ability to absorb almost anything without visible fracture. She had deployed it in business negotiations, at family dinners where things went unsaid that should have been screamed, on the phone with her doctors 3 months ago. When a specialist had told her something she had not yet told anyone in the world, she deployed it now. Min-jae, her voice was level. She glanced at Zuri, then at Amara, then back at him. This is a household matter. We can discuss. There's nothing to discuss. She's a child who has no business. She's 4 years old. The flat precision of it cut through Seo-ah's sentence, not loudly, not cruelly, just with the finality of a door being closed. Seo-ah looked at him for a moment, her jaw set. Then she looked at Amara. And in that look, just for a half second, in the cold winter light of the corridor, it was not quite anger. It was something more complicated than anger, something that lived underneath anger, in the place where grief goes when it has nowhere else to go. She turned and walked back toward the main stairs. Her heels were perfectly even on the marble. She did not look back. Min-jae stood in the corridor. The guard at the far end found somewhere else to look. The kitchen noise did not resume. The house stayed very still, the way houses stay still after something has passed through them that cannot be undone. Amara made herself look at him. She had spent 4 years perfecting the art of not looking directly at Kang Min-jae, not because of fear exactly, or not only fear. It was something more specific than fear, something she had never been able to name and had therefore simply managed. The way you manage a wound that never fully heals, carefully, consistently, without examining it too closely. He was looking at Zuri. Zuri had opened her fist again and was looking at the cufflink. Pretty, Zuri said, to nobody in particular. Minjae's gaze moved from the child to Amara. She held it for 3 seconds before she had to look away. Her hands were gripping the cleaning caddy too hard. She could feel the plastic handle pressing lines into her palm. She made herself release the grip, made herself breathe. "Thank you," she said. The words came out careful and small and professional, the words of an employee to an employer, maintained with the consistency she had maintained everything in this house for 4 years. "I apologize for the inconvenience. It won't—" "How old is she?" The question was direct and quiet, and it landed in Amara's chest like a stone dropped into deep water. 4, she said. 4. He said the number like he was doing arithmetic, like the word had a weight he was still measuring. He looked at Zuri again. The little girl had lost interest in the adult conversation and was examining the cufflink with the focused scientific interest that 4-year-olds bring to small, beautiful objects. She had it in both hands now, turning it in the light the same way she'd turned it when she found it on the floor. The stuffed rabbit was wedged under her arm, its frayed ear hanging down. Minjae watched her for a long moment. Amara was watching him watch her daughter, and the thing happening in her chest was not describable in clean language. It was cold. It was old. It was a fear she had trained herself to stop feeling years ago and had apparently only successfully buried because it was here now, fully intact, as if the burial had never taken place. "I'd like to talk," he said. He was still looking at Zuri. "Not here." "Mr. Kang?" He looked at her. She stopped. "Not here," he said again. Duh. The study was on the second floor, at the east corner of the house, with windows that looked out over the lower terrace and the city beyond. Seoul lay below the hill in the winter morning, enormous and gray and indifferent, the skyline sharp-edged against a colorless sky. Minjae had sent Zuri downstairs with one of the household staff, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Park, who had worked in the estate for 11 years and who treated Zuri with the quiet warmth of a grandmother, which was the closest thing to a grandmother that Zuri had ever known. Amara sat across from him in the study. No cleaning caddy, no apron, just her in a chair with her hands folded in her lap and the deliberate stillness of a woman who has learned to make herself small. Minjae stood by the window. He did not sit. He held his right wrist in his left hand, which is what he did when he was thinking. She knew this about him. She knew more about him than she should know about an employer. 4 years of proximity will do that, regardless of how carefully you try to maintain the appropriate distance. She knew he rubbed his jaw when he was frustrated. She knew he went to the kitchen at 2 a.m., when he couldn't sleep and stood at the counter eating cold rice with a spoon directly from the container. She knew he kept a single photograph in the top left drawer of this desk, face down, and that he had never once in 4 years moved it. She knew all of it, and she had spent 4 years pretending she didn't. He turned from the window. "Her birthday," he said. "When is it?" Something happened to Amara's breathing. "March," she said. "The 14th. He was doing math again. She could see it, the way his face went still and internal, the gaze not quite on her, running numbers, running backward through time with the precision he applied to everything. And she knew. She had always known this moment might come, had feared it and half hoped for it in equal measure without ever letting herself examine either feeling too carefully, that the math was going to work out. "March 14th, he said, quiet, almost to himself. "Mr. Kang, what did you name her?" His voice was different now, not the command voice, not the professional voice, something underneath those voices, something that had not been surfaced before, something she had not heard in a very long time and that she recognized anyway, immediately, with a physical response she could not control. Her hands tightened in her lap. "Zuri," she said. "What does it mean?" She had to clear her throat before she could answer. "It's Swahili. It means—" She stopped, swallowed. "It means beautiful." He didn't say anything. The city sat below the windows, indifferent and enormous. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And just like that, those 5 words, that quiet, that stillness, the 4 years she had spent constructing her answer to this question, rehearsing it, revising it, shoring it up against exactly this moment, collapsed entirely. Fell away like scaffolding when the building is done. Except the building wasn't done. The building had never been done. She had been standing in scaffolding the entire time, holding it up around herself and calling it a structure. She opened her mouth, and then she said the thing she had never let herself say out loud. I tried. But she told him the truth. Not quickly. It came out in fragments, the way truth tends to come out when it's been compressed under 4 years of silence. It came out with stops and reroutes, with places where her voice went flat and controlled, and she had to wait a moment before she could continue. She told him about the year they met. He had been in the United States, Chicago, under a different name, a different biography, traveling for what she'd understood to be business without understanding the specifics of what that business actually was. She had been 27, working at a hotel where he'd stayed for 3 weeks. They had met the way things sometimes happen, incidentally, sideways, without announcement. He had come down to the lobby bar at 11 one night when she was finishing a late shift, and they had talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything, and she had thought at the time that this was one of those rare encounters between people who recognize something in each other that doesn't have a clean name. She didn't tell him all of that. She told him the relevant chronology. 3 weeks. Then he was gone. Back to Korea, he'd said, because of a family emergency. He'd given her a number. She had used it. Once, twice, 10 times. The number rang and went to a message in Korean she couldn't understand. She'd written emails to the address he'd given her. No response. For 6 weeks, she'd tried every contact she had for him, which was very little, because she had understood even then that he was a private man who did not distribute himself easily, and gotten nothing. She stopped trying around the time she found out she was pregnant. Min-jae had not moved from his position by the window. He was very still. The kind of still that she associated with him at his most controlled, which, she had learned, was also him at his most dangerous. But this was different. This still was internal. This was a man holding himself together at the seams. You stopped trying, he said. After 2 months of nothing? She kept her voice level. I was 27, I had no money and no family nearby, and I had just found out I was going to have a child. I had to make decisions. You could have found me. With what? The composure cracked slightly. Not dramatically, just at one edge. I didn't know your real name. I didn't know what you actually did. I knew the name you'd given me and a phone number that never answered. I tried, Min-jae. I tried until I couldn't anymore. And then I had to take care of my daughter. She hadn't meant to use his name. Without the honorific, without the title. It came out of a time before all of this, out of 3 weeks in Chicago when none of the distance between their lives had been visible yet. He heard it. She saw him hear it, the slight shift in his face, the way the stillness changed quality without changing appearance. I didn't know, he said, and then, quieter, with a weight she hadn't expected. They intercepted them. He told her what he knew, not everything. He would piece the full picture together over the following days, working with the systematic precision he brought to tracking organizational failures, running backward through the communications from that year. But enough. Enough to tell her that when he'd returned to Korea, he had been walking into a transfer of power within the family organization that was contested, that was dangerous, that required, as certain people around him had decided, complete focus. That 2 of his then closest subordinates had made a decision, without his knowledge or authorization, to filter his incoming contacts from the period of his Chicago visit. That any message originating from an unknown American number, any email from an address he had never corresponded with through official channels, had been flagged and removed before reaching him. They had believed, those men, that they were protecting him. Or they had believed it was simpler than that a woman from Chicago was a distraction their future boss could not afford during a transition that people had died for. Either way, the messages had never arrived. Amara sat with this for a moment. She had imagined many versions of this conversation over 4 years. In some of them, she had been angry. In most of them, she had been careful, professional, the way she had trained herself to be in this house. In none of them had she imagined sitting across from him while he told her that the silence hadn't been his choice. Those men, she said carefully, are they still? No, he said, flat, final, not elaborating. She didn't ask the follow-up question. I came here by accident, she said instead. I want you to know that. I found the position through an agency. The estate was listed under a company name. I didn't know. She stopped, corrected herself. I suspected, maybe, when I first arrived, certain things. She looked at the desk, at the window. not at him. But I had a 4-year-old daughter, and I needed work. And by the time I was certain enough that I might have done something about it, I had been here 6 months, and I had convinced myself it didn't matter, that it was over, that the past was the past. And then, he said, she looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. And then I watched you pass Zuri in the hallway one afternoon, and she smiled at you, and you... She stopped. Her throat closed briefly. She pushed through it. You smiled back, and it was the same. The exact same smile. And I thought, she couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He understood. The silence lasted a long time. Outside, Seoul sat under its gray winter sky. Down in the house, somewhere below, Zuri was probably sitting with Mrs. Park in the kitchen, eating something, talking in the cheerful, unfocused monologue that 4-year-olds conduct with equal enthusiasm toward adults who are listening and adults who aren't. Minjae turned back toward the window. His reflection was there in the glass, partial, shadowed, overlaid against the city below. She could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. She was looking for something in the posture, some readable signal, but he had spent his entire adult life training his body not to broadcast. I want a test, he said, a DNA test. I want it done properly with a doctor I trust, and I want results before the end of the week. Yes, she said, because she had no reason to refuse. She had known, on some level had known, since the moment she walked through the gates of this estate 4 years ago, had buried the knowing and smoothed concrete over the top of it and planted orderly facts on the surface. She had known what the results would be. Until then, he said, you and Zuri remain in the house, under my protection. If Seoa has an objection, it's mine to manage. The phrase sat oddly in the air. Under my protection. As if they were something to be secured rather than people who had been managing their own security for 4 years without any assistance from anyone. She didn't say that. And after, she said instead. He turned from the window. His face in the direct light of the study was older than she remembered from Chicago. Not worn, not in the way that suffering wears a face, but tempered, settled into itself. The face of a man who had spent the intervening years becoming exactly who he was always going to become. We handle what's true, he said. It wasn't a comforting answer. It wasn't meant to be. He was not a man who trafficked in false comfort, which was perhaps the thing she had recognized in him all those years ago in Chicago, in the bar at 11 o'clock at night, that he didn't perform gentleness that wasn't real. She stood up. I need to get back to Zuri, she said. He nodded once. She moved toward the door. Amara. She stopped. She didn't turn fully, just enough to show she was listening. She looks like you, he said. Around the eyes. She didn't trust her voice for a full response. She laughs like you too, she said, and then she walked out of the study and pulled the door closed behind her and stood in the corridor for just a moment with her back against the door, pressing one hand flat against the wall, breathing. Just breathing. The DNA results came back on a Thursday, 3 days later. Dr. Shin brought them in a sealed envelope and placed them on the desk in the study. Minjae did not open them immediately. He sat with the envelope on the desk in front of him for a full minute, which was, by his standards, a very long time to hold still without acting. Then he opened it. He read the document twice. He set it back on the desk and sat for another long moment with both hands flat on the leather surface, looking at the confirmation that 99.97% probability was the closest thing science could offer to absolute certainty. He called his chief of staff. He issued 3 orders. Then he went to find his daughter. He found Zuri in the garden behind the house, despite the cold. She was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for her, borrowed from somewhere in the household supply of child-sized things that Mrs. Park had assembled over years of Zuri's presence in the house. She was crouched in the corner of the garden where the ornamental grasses had gone brown and brittle in the winter, examining something on the ground with focused attention. The stuffed rabbit was sitting propped against the garden wall, observing the proceedings. He watched her for a moment from the doorway. She was talking to herself, or to the rabbit possibly, or to whatever she'd found in the grass, narrating in the soft mix of English and Korean she'd developed over 4 years of living in this house. That small private language she'd built herself without anyone planning it for her. He stepped into the garden. She heard him and looked up, saw who it was. Did not smile exactly, something more cautious than a smile. something that wanted to be a smile but was doing a preliminary risk assessment first. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down to her level. "What did you find?" he said. She considered him for another moment. Then she held out her palm. A small gray pebble. Perfectly ordinary. "It's smooth," she said, with the gravity of a scientist presenting data. He looked at the pebble. "It is," he said. "I'm collecting them," she said. "The smooth ones." "How many do you have?" She thought about this with visible effort. 7. "No." A recount, fingers moving slightly. 8. "This one is 8. He looked at her face, at the gap where the milk tooth had fallen out, at the enormous brown eyes that had some of her mother in them. Yes, around the shape, around the openness, and something else. Something that had been looking back at him from mirrors his entire life. He had known it before the envelope. He had known it before the study, before the test, before the corridor, and the cufflink, and Sioa's verdict, and all of it. He had known it the way you know things you cannot yet say, in the place where certainty lives before language reaches it. "Can I see the collection?" he said. Zuri looked at him for another long moment. Then she stood up and took his hand with the natural authority of a child who has decided someone is trustworthy, and led him toward the corner of the garden where the other 7 smooth pebbles were arranged in a line along the low stone border, waiting. Min-jae followed. Above the garden, in the window of the corridor that ran along the east side of the second floor, Amara stood looking down at them. Her hand was over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. She stood there for a long time, watching her daughter hold the hand of the man who didn't know yet how much he was about to lose. All those years, all those firsts, all those small, ordinary moments that were the substance of a childhood, and how much he was about to find. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Not household staff, not guards. Heels. Even, precise, unhurried. Sewa stopped beside her at the window. Both women looked down at the garden. Zuri was showing Min-jae the pebbles, arranging them with curatorial seriousness, explaining something that neither of the women at the window could hear. Seoa's face, in profile, was unreadable, composed. The composure Amara had always envied and feared in equal measure. That absolute surface, that refusal to be a weather system. But Amara was close enough now to see what the distance had always obscured. Seoa's jaw was held just slightly too tight. Her right hand, pressed against the window frame, was pressing just slightly too hard, and her eyes, fixed on the child in the garden below, were not quite the eyes of a woman who felt what she appeared to feel. They were the eyes of a woman who was fighting not to feel something else entirely. Amara did not know what to do with this information. She didn't have room for it yet, in the crowded architecture of everything she was managing. She filed it away somewhere she could find it later. Neither of them spoke. Below, Min-jae picked up one of the smooth pebbles and turned it in his fingers, and said something that made Zuri laugh. That sudden, complete laugh that belonged entirely to her, that came from her belly, and took over her whole small face. That laugh that Amara had spent 4 years considering the best sound she had ever heard. Seoa's hand pressed harder against the window frame, and then she turned and walked away, back down the corridor, her heels perfectly even on the marble, and Amara was alone at the window again. She looked down at her daughter. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. That night, after Zuri was asleep, tucked in the small room adjacent to Amara's quarters, rabbit wedged under her arm, one hand flat on the pillow in the specific sleeping posture she'd had since infancy, Amara sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall and tried to calculate what came next. She was not good at not knowing. Not knowing was the condition she had most feared since the day she'd understood she was on her own. And she had spent 4 years building systems, practical, logistical, financial, to protect herself from the exposure of not knowing. She had a number in a savings account. She had a backup plan. She had, at various points over the 4 years, a list of other jobs she could go to if this one ended. All of that felt suddenly theoretical. Min-jae knew. The test confirmed it. The orders he had issued, she didn't know their specifics, but she knew the nature of them, because she had watched this man work for 4 years, and she understood the velocity at which he operated once he had made a decision. What she didn't know was what those decisions would mean for her daughter. What she didn't know was what she wanted them to mean. She lay back on the bed, still dressed, staring at the ceiling, and let herself do the thing she never let herself do, which was to not have the answer, to sit with the question, to not smooth it over or manage it or apply a practical framework to it. Her daughter had a father. The father was Kang Min-jae, the feared, untouchable, dangerously powerful Kang Min-jae, who had sat in a winter garden this afternoon and held 8 smooth pebbles in his palm, while a 4-year-old explained her collection system, and whose face had done something in that moment that she had seen from a second-floor window and that she had been trying, unsuccessfully, not to think about since. She turned on her side. Across the hall, through the wall, her daughter slept. Down the corridor, through the east wing, in his study or his bedroom, or pacing the length of that room at 2 a.m. the way he paced when the decisions were too large for sitting still, Min-jae was thinking too. She was certain of that. What she didn't know was whether, when all of it shook down and the dust settled, they would be standing in the same place. She didn't know if that was what she wanted. She wasn't sure. And the dark and the cold and the vast, complicated silence of the Kang estate on a Thursday night with snow beginning to fall outside, whether she was allowed to want it. The snow came down past her window, silent and indifferent and very white in the dark. She was still awake at midnight when she heard his footsteps in the kitchen below, the familiar 2 a.m. restlessness arriving early, and she lay still and listened without meaning to, without deciding to, as the sounds traveled through the house, cabinet, spoon, container of cold rice, the particular quiet of a man eating alone in the kitchen of a house that was not yet, by anyone's definition, a home. She was still listening when she fell asleep, and downstairs in the kitchen, Kang Min-jae stood with a spoon in his hand and a truth on the table in front of him, sealed in a manila envelope, 99.97% probability, the closest thing science could offer to absolute certainty, and tried to calculate how a man begins to know a daughter he has already lost 4 years of. He had no system for this. He had built systems for everything. He had no system for this. Outside, the snow was covering Seoul, covering the garden where the 8 smooth pebbles still sat in their careful line along the border, covering everything in the city below with its patient, indifferent white, and somewhere in the estate above him, in a small room adjacent to her mother's quarters, his daughter slept with a stuffed rabbit under her arm. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. When he finally moved, it wasn't toward his office or his files or the phone with the secure line. He went upstairs. He stopped outside the door of the small room where Zuri slept. He did not open it. He stood in the corridor with one hand against the door frame and listened to the complete silence on the other side of the wood, and what crossed his face in that moment, in the dark corridor with the snow coming down outside and the house sleeping around him, was not the face he showed the world. It was something older than that, and raw, and it moved through him like the first real thing he had felt in a very long time. He stood there until it passed. Then he went back down to his study, and behind him, in the corridor, the door to Zuri's room opened exactly 2 inches, just enough for a small face with enormous brown eyes to peer out into the dark, and then closed again, soft and careful, without a sound. The morning after the snow, the house woke up wrong. Not loudly, not with any single event that could be pointed to and named. Just that specific atmospheric shift that happens in enclosed spaces when something has changed in the structure of power and everyone feels it before anyone says it. The staff moving a fraction more carefully than usual, conversations cut shorter, the kitchen quieter at breakfast. The guards at the main entrance holding their posture with that extra rigidity that meant word had traveled and nobody was sure yet what it meant for them. Min-jae was already in his study at 6 in the morning when Amara brought Zuri downstairs. He didn't come out. The door was closed, and the low murmur of a phone call was audible from the corridor. Not the words, just the tone, which was clipped and had no patience in it. Business. The organization. The world that existed parallel to and completely separate from what had happened in this house over the last 4 days. Amara got Zuri fed and settled with Mrs. Park, and then returned to her work, because work was the one territory in this house that had always been fully hers. She cleaned. She managed the household inventory. She dealt with the linen service and the kitchen supply order and the small persistent maintenance issue in the 3rd guest bathroom that she'd been waiting 3 weeks for the plumber to address. She did all of it with the focused competence she'd been doing it with for 4 years, and she kept the rest of herself locked down in a room she didn't open. She was stripping the bed in the 2nd guest room at 9:30 when she heard Seoa's voice in the corridor. Not raised. Seoa never raised her voice, but something in the quality of it, a tightness, a compression, like sound being produced under pressure, made Amara go still. "I want to speak with him." One of the staff, she couldn't tell who from the voice alone. "He's on a call, Ms. Yoon," he said. I know what he said. Tell him I'm waiting in the sitting room. Silence. Then footsteps. Then silence again. Amara finished the bed. Minjae came out of his study at 10:15. He found Seoa in the east sitting room, standing at the window with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk. She heard him come in and didn't turn immediately. Let the moment sit for a breath or two, which he recognized as the opening move of a conversation she'd been preparing. He closed the door. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He sat anyway. She turned from the window and looked at him. Her composure was intact. It was always intact. He had spent 8 months engaged to this woman, and he had seen it crack exactly once. The morning in the corridor, the cufflink on the floor, the 30 seconds before she collected herself. And he had spent the subsequent days thinking about what had been underneath the crack. "I deserve an explanation," she said. "You deserve honesty," he said, "which is what I'm going to give you." "Then give it." He looked at her. The test confirmed it. "Zuri is my daughter." Something moved in Seoa's face. Contained, rapid, gone. She lifted the cup and set it down without drinking. "When did you know?" "I suspected before the test. I knew when she was born once the dates worked out." He paused. "I didn't know Amara was pregnant. I didn't know about any of it until 4 days ago." "And you believe her?" "The test confirmed that the child is yours, not that the rest of it is true." Her voice was even, careful. "She says she tried to reach you. She says the messages were intercepted. Very convenient." "I verified it." A pause. "You verified it," she repeated, "in 2 days." "Yes." She turned back toward the window. He watched the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness in her back that he had learned to read as the equivalent of visible emotion in someone who would never let visible emotion do its job. 8 months, she said. Seo, 8 months, Minjae. You didn't know she existed, and I understand that, but she's been in this house for 4 years. In my house, it's my house. The correction came automatically. He heard how it sounded and didn't take it back. Soa absorbed it without flinching. "In the house I was going to live in," she said, with a precision that made the correction feel small. "And every time I saw that child in the corridors, every time she was underfoot in the kitchen or running in the garden," she stopped. He waited. "You never told me," she said, "that she was the housekeeper's daughter. You never explained the—" She searched for the word. The latitude, the allowances, a child running loose in this household, and no explanation. "I didn't know who she was." "But you knew she was here, and you didn't send them away." He was quiet for a moment. "No, I didn't." "Why?" The question sat in the room. He didn't have a clean answer, and he didn't manufacture one. He had not sent them away because something had always prevented him from making that particular order. Some resistance he hadn't examined and hadn't needed to examine. Some pull that operated below the level of reason. He had walked past that little girl in his corridors 100 times, and each time something had snagged, briefly, on some unmarked place inside him. He hadn't known what it was. Now he knew. "I didn't know why at the time," he said. Seoa looked at him. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the truth." She set down the cup completely, on the side table, with a finality that meant the tea was over and they were both past the point of pretending this was a measured conversation. "What happens now?" she said. "To us." He had been waiting for this sentence. "I don't know yet," he said. "You don't know." She said it flatly, not a question. "I need time to what? To decide between your fiancé and your hidden child?" The composure was still there, but there was something live underneath it now, something that had heat in it. "I've rearranged my life, Minjae. I've moved into this house. I've told my family, I've managed their expectations, I've spent 8 months—" "I know. Don't interrupt me." He stopped. She breathed, one breath, controlled. "I have been preparing," she said, "to build a life here. And now I'm being asked to absorb the existence of a child. His child, with another woman. A woman who has been in this house the entire time I've been engaged to you. And to what? Wait? While you decide? No one is asking you to wait." It landed harder than he intended. He saw it register in her face. "Then what are you asking?" Her voice dropped, just slightly, just enough. "Tell me exactly what you're asking." He leaned forward in the chair, both hands on his knees. "I'm asking for time to do this right," he said. Not for your sake, not for mine. For that child downstairs who has never in her life had a father, and who is 4 years old and who deserves to not have the adults around her use her as a bargaining piece. Silence. The heat in Seoa's face changed quality. Still there, but shifted. I wouldn't do that, she said. The corridor, he said. Yesterday morning. Her jaw tightened. I don't have patience for cruelty to children, he said. Not loudly. He didn't need loudly. Whatever is happening between you and me, whatever you're feeling, whatever this does to our arrangement, she is 4 years old. She is mine. And anyone in this house who treats her as an inconvenience, I understand, Seoa said. Do you? The question was direct and without decoration. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face that he couldn't fully read. Layers of it, compressed together, the way sediment compresses. Then she picked up her phone from the side table and held it in both hands and said quietly, Yes, but the plumber came at noon. He worked in the third guest bathroom for an hour and a half, and when he was done, Amara walked him to the service entrance and signed the invoice and stood at the door watching his van drive out through the gate while the cold air came in around her and she let it, because the cold was clarifying and she needed clarifying. She had not seen Min-jae since the morning. She had not seen Seoa since the sitting room door had opened at 11:15, and Seoa had walked out and down the main corridor with her heels even, and her face arranged and not looked in Amara's direction, which Amara had stood very still and managed. She went back inside. Mrs. Park was in the kitchen with Zuri, the two of them at the big table with a pile of tangerines between them and some kind of drawing project underway. Paper, markers, the earnest concentration of a child who has decided her work is serious. Mrs. Park was peeling tangerines with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades in proximity to children and knew how to be with them without making a production of it. Amara stood in the kitchen doorway and just looked. She looked at her daughter's bent head, the marker moving in thick, deliberate strokes. The rabbit on the chair beside her because it always needed its own chair, this rabbit. That was a rule Zuri had established at age 2 and never abandoned. Mrs. Park's hands peeling the tangerines. The cold winter light at the window, the whole small scene of it. She thought, I could pack us up and leave. The thought came and she held it and turned it over. She had a number in a savings account. She had backup plans. She had, in the 4 years she had worked in this house, maintained the infrastructure of independent life with deliberate care, exactly because she had always known, on some level, in some room in herself she didn't open, that the exit had to remain viable, had to remain real. She could pack them up tonight and be on a flight to Chicago by morning. The thought completed itself. And then she looked at her daughter, who had looked up at this moment with marker-stained fingers and said, without preamble, Mama, do you think 8 pebbles is enough, or should I get more? Amara crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table. Depends, she said. What are you building? A border, Zuri said, with the confidence of a city planner, for my garden. Your garden. The corner. With the brown grass. She looked up. He said, I could have it. The man. Amara went very still. Which man? Zuri looked at her with the mild expression of someone explaining the obvious. The man from yesterday. With the pebbles. She returned to her drawing. He said I could have that corner for my garden when it's warm again. He said we could plant things. Mrs. Park was looking at her tangerine. Amara looked at her daughter drawing her garden border with marker on paper at the kitchen table. She thought about a man standing in a corridor in the dark with his hand against a door frame. She thought about all the things she did not yet know how to do with this situation. That's nice, she said. Her voice came out even. What are you going to plant? Min-jae spent the afternoon on the phone, not the business calls. Those were managed, delegated, rerouted. These were different. His lawyer, his personal financial officer. A family documentation specialist he had used twice before, under circumstances he did not need to revisit. He issued instructions with the systematic efficiency he applied to restructuring a criminal network's supply chain, which he understood was perhaps not the appropriate framework for this particular situation, but was the only framework he had. He was establishing custody documentation. He was establishing a formal record of paternity. He was, in effect, building a paper structure around a fact that had existed for 4 years without one. At 3 in the afternoon, he stopped. He stood at his study window and looked at the garden below. The 8 pebbles were still there on the stone border, slightly displaced by the snow that had fallen and partially melted. 8 small gray shapes, ordinary and smooth and arranged with a 4-year-old's precise sense of order. He had sat with her yesterday and held them. He had sat with her and held them and listened to her explain her criteria. Must be smooth, must be gray or close to gray, must be the right size, which appeared to mean small enough to fit in a 4-year-old's palm with room to spare. He had listened to all of this with the focused attention he gave to the briefings his lieutenants brought him, and he had thought, 4 years. There are 4 years of this that I don't have. 4 years of criteria and systems and small authorities she's built for herself. An entire world assembled without him in it. He pressed one hand against the cold glass. He did not allow himself to remain in the feeling. It was a luxury, and he knew it. This grief, this specific species of loss. And he had never been a man who could afford luxury in his emotional life. He processed it, and he filed it, and he moved. He went downstairs. He found Amara in the east corridor, rehanging a painting that had been taken down for cleaning. She had her back to him, standing on the lower rung of a short stepladder, and he stood in the corridor entrance for a moment before she heard him and turned. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him for 4 years, cautious, controlled, the professional default. And then something crossed her face that was newer than that, a wariness that was more specific, that knew too much now for the professional default to fully cover it. She stepped down from the ladder. I want to talk about what you need, he said. She blinked. What I need? Practically, the child, He stopped, corrected himself. Zuri, what does she need that she doesn't have? Amara looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. The wariness still there, but underneath it, something that might have been, in different circumstances, close to humor. Not warm humor. The kind that comes from exhaustion. Are you asking me to give you a list? She said. Yes. You want me to list my daughter's needs? I'm trying to. I know what you're trying to do. She said it without sharpness, which was almost more pointed than sharp. You're trying to be efficient about it. You've got a problem and you want to solve it, and you want the solving to go quickly because you operate on a timeline and other people's messes don't wait for you. He held her gaze. Is that wrong? No, she said, honestly. But she's not a problem. She's a person. And she doesn't need a list. She needs... She stopped. She needs consistency. She needs to know the ground under her isn't going to shift. That's the only thing she's ever needed. He was quiet for a moment. I understand that. Do you? Not aggressive. Genuine question. My ground shifted when I was 8, he said. So yes, she hadn't expected that. He could see it. The slight adjustment in her expression. The recalibration. Then you know? She said quietly. I know. They stood in the corridor with the half-rehung painting between them and 4 years of unmade decisions pressing on the air, and neither of them moved for a moment, and the house was very quiet around them. Then Min-jae said, She told me she's planning a garden in the spring. Something shifted in Amara's face. The exhaustion was still there, the caution, the years of it. But something else moved through it briefly. Not softness, exactly. Just humanity. Just the unguarded thing. She tells everyone, Amara said, but Seoa found her at 6. Not in the corridor. Not in front of the staff. She found her in the laundry room at the back of the service wing, which was the one room in the house that Amara had always been certain Seoa had never been inside. It wasn't cruelty that brought her there, or the desire to catch Amara in her subordinate context. When Amara looked up and saw her in the doorway, it was clear she hadn't planned the location. She was looking for a place without an audience. The laundry room offered that. Seoa came inside and closed the door. She was wearing different clothes than the morning, less formal, which on Seoa still constituted formal by most standards. Her composure was in place. But around her eyes, there was the specific quality of skin that's been carrying tension for too long. Not showing yet, not visibly cracking, but on its way. Amara stopped what she was doing, stood with a folded sheet against her front and waited. I'm not here to cause a problem, Seoa said. Okay, Amara said carefully. I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like a direct answer. I'll try. Seoa looked at her. The room was small. The dryers were running. 2 of them, a low rhythmic heat in the space. There was nowhere to position yourself for power in a laundry room. That was probably why she'd chosen it. Did you know, Seoa said, when you took this position, who he was. Amara set the sheet down on the folding table. Not at first, she said. Not when I applied. The estate was listed under a company name. I came for the interview, and the person who interviewed me was the household manager. I didn't see him until my third day. And then? Then I suspected. She kept her voice even. And I spent about 2 months convincing myself I was wrong. Were you convincing yourself, Seoa said, or protecting yourself? The precision of it landed. Amara looked at her. This woman she had watched for the past several days with a wariness she now recognized was mutual. Both, she said honestly. Seoa held her gaze for a long moment. He's going to do right by her, Seoa said. Not a question. A statement. And underneath it the texture of something that had already been decided. That Seoa had already accepted in some room inside herself. That's what he does. When he decides something is right, he does it. Thoroughly. Without... She stopped. He doesn't do things by half. I know, Amara said quietly. I know you know. Something in Seoa's voice that hadn't been there before. Not warm, not quite, but not the cold architecture either. You've watched him for 4 years. You know him in ways I don't. She paused. That's not an accusation. I know. They stood in the heat of the laundry room for a moment. I was told 3 months ago, Seoa said, that having children may not be possible for me. She said it the way someone says a thing they have said 0 times before, with the particular acoustic quality of words that have only existed as interior sound until now. Flat. Controlled. But raw underneath the control, the way a bone is raw under skin. I haven't told Min-jae. I haven't told anyone. Amara said nothing. She understood that the wrong response would close the door immediately and permanently. She stood still and let it sit. Every time I saw your daughter, Seoa said, She didn't finish the sentence. Her jaw did the thing it did. Held. You didn't need to be cruel to her, Amara said. She kept her voice quiet. Not accusatory, just true. No, Seoa said. I didn't. Silence. The dryers ran. What happens between you and Min-jae, Amara said carefully, is not something I can speak to. That's not my business, and I've never made it my business. But, Seoa said, but Zuri needs to be safe in this house. Whoever is in it, whatever happens between all the adults. She is 4 years old, and she needs to be safe and treated with dignity. Her voice stayed even. The shake was there, underneath, but contained. That's the only thing I'm asking. Seoa looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once. It was not a warm nod. It was not a beginning of friendship nod. It was the nod of a woman who had said a true thing in a laundry room and was not yet sure what to do with the rest of it, but had made one commitment and would keep it. She turned and left. The door closed. Amara stood in the heat with her hands on the folding table and breathed. It was 8 p.m. when everything collapsed. Zuri was already in bed. Amara was in the kitchen finishing the dinner cleanup when she heard the raised voices from the direction of the main corridor. Not from a room with a closed door, but out in the open house, which meant it had moved past the point of managed privacy. She set down the dish towel. When she reached the corridor, Min-jae was standing at the foot of the main staircase with a phone in one hand, and 3 feet from him stood a man she had never seen before. Late 50s, heavy-shouldered, in an overcoat that had come in from the cold and not yet been offered a place to sit. He had the specific bearing of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging around his arrival. Behind him, 2 men she recognized as external. Not household staff, not the estate guards. Different. The type she had learned in 4 years of this household to categorize without naming. Min-jae's face was a wall. The older man was speaking in Korean, rapid and low, and she caught perhaps a quarter of it, enough to understand the register, which was not a request. It was a reminder. The word that kept recurring was one she knew, obligation, family. And one other word repeated twice that she had heard before in this house and had learned to treat as a signal to make herself scarce. She turned to go. Min-jae said her name, not Ms. Johnson, not Amara, with the careful distance of the past few days, just her name, short and direct, the way he'd said it in Chicago, which she recognized immediately and which stopped her mid-step. Stay, he said. She turned back. The older man looked at her. The look was thorough and brief and did not require words. She had received looks like that before. Assessments, categorizations, the specific gaze of men who process other people as variables. She held it without moving. Minjae spoke to the man in Korean for a long moment. She didn't catch all of it, but she caught enough. She caught the sentence that contained Zuri's name. She caught the one that contained the word for daughter. She caught the one delivered with a quiet that was colder than any volume, that meant, in its essential meaning, this is not open for discussion. The older man looked at her again. Then he spoke one sentence that she caught entirely because it was delivered in careful, deliberate Korean designed to be understood. He said, "The Kong family does not acknowledge mixed blood heirs." The corridor was very still. Minjae did not move for 3 full seconds. Amara felt the bottom of something drop out of her stomach, drop clean through the floor, fall all the way to whatever was under the Kang estate on its hill above Seoul, and keep falling. She had known. She had always known, in that room she didn't open, that this particular wall existed. Had not let herself think about it directly. Had smoothed concrete over it the same way she'd smoothed concrete over everything she couldn't afford to examine. 4 years of concrete. And now she was standing in a corridor at 8 in the evening with the wall right in front of her face and no concrete left. Minjae turned to her. His face, in this moment, was doing something she had never seen it do in 4 years. Not the professional wall, not the 2 a.m. kitchen face, private and unguarded. Something else. Something that was very close, in its quality, to what she had seen from the second-floor window when he was in the garden with the pebbles. But harder. Older. The face of a man who had just understood the full weight of the choice that was in front of him. He looked at her. She looked at him. And in that look was the full architecture of everything that had not been said. Chicago, the years, the silence, the test, the pebbles, the garden, the cold rice at 2 a.m., all of it, compressed into the 10 feet of corridor between them. He turned back to the older man. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet. She understood every word. He said, "Get out of my house." The older man's face did not change. He looked at Minjae for a long, measuring moment. Then he looked at Amara one final time. Not the assessment look this time. Something colder. Something that was a message. Not about what was being said in this corridor tonight, but about what would come after. Then he nodded to his men and walked toward the main entrance. The door opened. The cold air came in. The door closed. Minjae stood at the foot of his staircase in the silence the man had left behind and did not move. Amar stood in the corridor and understood, with a clarity that was not comforting, that the older man's exit was not a defeat. It was a postponement. She understood it with the clarity of a woman who had spent 4 years reading the temperature of rooms she was never supposed to understand. The older man, whoever he was in the hierarchy of the Kang family's organizational structure, whatever authority he carried under that overcoat, had not come here tonight to be convinced. He had come to deliver a message and to look at the variables and to calculate, and he had left with all his calculations intact. Minjae had won the room. He had not won the problem. She went upstairs. She did not speak to Minjae again that night. There was nothing to say that could be said cleanly, and she had learned, from 4 years of this house, from 27 years of being a woman who understood when she was in a room where the real conversation was happening somewhere else, that speaking into an incomplete silence only fills it with the wrong words. She checked on Zuri. Asleep, the rabbit in its place, one small hand flat on the pillow, the nightlight making the room orange and warm. Amara stood in the doorway for a long time, longer than she needed to, not touching anything, just looking. Then she went to her room and sat on the bed and did not sleep. In the morning she could hear, through the architecture of the house, that Minjae had been in his study all night. Not the 2 a.m. kitchen this time, no cold rice, no spoon, just the murmur of calls, continuous, running through the wall at intervals until sometime past 4 when they stopped and the house went fully silent. She lay in the silence and thought about the older man's final look. Not the assessment, the message. She had seen that look before, in other contexts, on other faces, in the years before this house, when she had been navigating the world without the specific insulation that the Kang estate's walls provided. She had grown up in Chicago understanding certain kinds of looks. The look that says, you are in a situation that is larger than you, and the situation does not require your consent. She had thought she'd put enough distance between herself and that look. She understood now that she had only put geography between them. The call came at 10 the next morning. She was in the third floor linen storage when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize, Korean area code, which alone was enough to make the back of her neck tighten. She answered it because not answering unknown numbers in this household was not an option she had ever permitted herself. Information, in this world, flowed toward the people willing to receive it. The voice on the other end was female, older, Korean with a precision that was almost formal, the deliberate diction of someone who had learned to speak as if words were instruments. "Ms. Johnson," the voice said, "my name is not important. What I have to tell you is." Amara's hand tightened on the phone. "I'm listening," she said. "The man who came to the estate last night is Kang Byung-soo, Min Jae's uncle. He is not simply a family member. He is the current chair of the Kang Family Council, the governing body that ratifies leadership decisions within the organization. Min Jae's authority as boss is real, but it operates within a framework that the council maintains. He can overrule individuals. He cannot overrule the council unanimously." The linen storage was very quiet. Outside, somewhere below, she could hear Zuri's voice in the garden. Mrs. Park had taken her out in the weak winter sun, the small sounds of a child being alive and ordinary in the world. "Why are you telling me this?" Amara said. "Because you need to understand the structure before you can understand what's happening in Siramit." Min Jae issued 3 documentation orders 2 days ago: paternity, custody framework, estate acknowledgement. Byung-soo knows about all 3. He came last night to deliver the council's position before the documentation was finalized. "And the council's position is what the man said. The council's position," the voice said carefully, "is that formal acknowledgement of your daughter as a Kang heir creates a structural vulnerability in the family's public legitimacy framework. Mixed heritage within the direct bloodline has historically been managed through discretion." The word sat on the wire between them like something dropped in water. "Managed through discretion," Amara repeated. "There is precedent," the voice said. 22 years ago, a similar situation arose. The child was relocated. The mother was given a settlement. The matter was removed from the record. Amara sat down on the low shelf behind her because her legs had done something unreliable. "Who are you?" she said. A pause. "Someone who believes Min Jae is walking into a fight he has not yet fully mapped," the voice said, "and that you are standing in the center of that fight without a complete picture. Tell me the rest." The documentation Min Jae ordered, it doesn't just establish paternity, it triggers an automatic review clause in the family charter. That clause requires council ratification for any heir acknowledgement that carries inheritance implications. Without ratification, the documentation is internally valid but organizationally unenforceable. Byung-soo knows this. Min Jae knows this. What Min Jae may not have calculated is the timeline. What timeline? The review clause has a 72-hour response window from the moment of filing. The documentation was filed the day before yesterday. Another pause. The window closes tonight at midnight. Amara did not move. And if the council votes against ratification tonight, then the documentation is invalidated. Zuri's status within the family structure remains informal. And Byung-soo has sufficient authority within the council to push for the traditional solution, which is relocation. Yes. The garden sounds drifted up. Zuri laughing at something Mrs. Park had said, that complete whole-body laugh, carrying up through the cold air as clearly as if she were in the room. "What does Min Jae know about this call?" Amara said. "He doesn't know I called you." A beat. "He knows the timeline. He has known since yesterday. He's been managing the council members individually. He has relationships with 3 of the 7. He's been working through the night." Another pause, shorter. "There are 4 members whose votes are not secured. 4 out of 7. The math was instant and terrible. "Why are you telling me what he doesn't know you're telling me?" she said. The voice was quiet for a moment. "Because the precedent I mentioned," it said, "the child 22 years ago. I was the woman who accepted the settlement." Another silence, very different in quality from the previous ones. "I have spent 22 years with a different picture than the one on my wall." The call ended. Oh, she sat in the linen storage for 4 minutes. She counted them. She needed them to be finite, to have a number she could move past when they were done. 4 minutes in which she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what the woman on the phone had handed her. The structure, the timeline, the council, the precedent, the word relocation, and to feel it completely, without the management of it, without the concrete, without smoothing. Then she stood up. She went downstairs. She did not go to Min Jae's study. She went to the kitchen because the kitchen was where she thought clearly, where her hands could do something while her brain worked. And she stood at the counter and made tea she didn't intend to drink and ran through everything the woman had said with the systematic attention she gave to the household's monthly accounts. 3 secured votes out of 7. 4 unsecured. Midnight tonight. Min Jae had been working the council members individually through the night, and he hadn't told her. She put the kettle down. He hadn't told her. She stood with this for a moment. Not with anger, or not only anger, with the specific quality of recognition that comes when a pattern you thought you'd escaped reappears in new clothing. 4 years ago, she had been on the outside of decisions being made about her life by men who had decided she was a variable to be managed, and the decisions had reached her as consequences rather than as information. She had thought this time was different. She had thought this time she was inside the house. She picked up the kettle again, set it on the burner, stood with her hands on the counter. Then she heard the study door open. Min Jae looked like the man who had not slept and had no remaining patience for the appearance of having slept. His jacket was gone, sleeves rolled, and there was a specific quality of stillness to him that she had never seen before. Not the professional controlled stillness, not the 2 a.m. kitchen stillness. This was the stillness of a man who has been running hard in an enclosed space for 18 hours and has not yet found the door. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved in his face, quickly, gone, quickly. A calculation. "We need to talk," she said. "I know." "Midnight tonight," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Who called you?" he said. It was not a question. "Someone who gave me information you apparently decided I didn't need." His jaw set. "I was managing it," he said. "You were managing it." She kept her voice even, flat. The voice she used when even was the only thing standing between her and the version of herself that she could not afford right now. 4 secured votes needed, 3 in hand, midnight tonight, and you were managing it without telling me that my daughter might be removed from this house by end of business today. That's not going to happen. That is exactly what the traditional solution is, Min Jae. Relocation. It happened 22 years ago. The woman who called me, she was the mother. Something happened in his face that was not quite surprise. He had known about the precedent. She could see that he'd known. He'd known and had placed it in a category he'd labeled manageable and had proceeded. "I have 3 votes," he said. "You need 4. I'm aware of what I need." "Are you aware that Byung-soo came here last night not to warn you, but to count?" Her voice stayed level, but the edges of it had heat now. "He came to see us. To see me. To see Zuri." He was calculating, Min Jae. He wanted to know exactly what he was up against before he walked into that council room tonight. Min Jae was very still. "The 4th vote," she said. "Who is it?" He didn't answer immediately. "Who is it?" "Kang Dong-hyun," he said. "My father's younger brother. He's been abstaining from council votes for 3 years. A personal grievance with Byung-soo over a business decision. He has the capacity to break the block." He paused. "I've been unable to reach him directly. His people say he's traveling." "Is he traveling, or is he refusing your calls?" "A beat too long." "Both," he said. She turned away from him for a moment, faced the window above the sink. The garden was visible from here. Mrs. Park sitting on the cold stone bench, Zuri crouched in her corner inspecting something in the dead grass, the 8 pebbles in their line on the border. She looked at the pebbles. She thought about the woman on the phone, 22 years of a different picture than the one on the wall. She turned back. "You should have told me," she said. "Yesterday, when you knew the timeline. I didn't want to." "To what? Frighten me?" The even finally cracked. Just at one edge, one place, but it cracked. "I have been frightened for 4 days, Min Jae. I have been frightened since the moment that man walked through your front door. I've been sitting with it alone because you have been managing it, and I am not supposed to be frightened by the things you're managing. Is that right? I should just wait in my room while you work the phones and hope you get to 4 before midnight." He looked at her. He didn't defend himself, which was the right thing to do, and she recognized it, and it didn't make her less angry. It just changed the shape of the anger from something hot to something colder and more durable. "Tell me what I can do," she said. "You can't tell me what I can do?" He held her gaze for a long moment. She watched him run the calculation. The familiar internal process, the weighing, and she waited for him to come out the other side of it with a managed answer, a partial answer, the kind that kept the critical information inside the room he was working in. Instead, he said, Donghyun has a daughter, my cousin, 30 years old. She lives in Busan, and she's been estranged from the family council structure for 6 years. She and I had a relationship when we were young, not that kind. He stopped. Close. We were close. She left because of Byung-soo. A specific situation I don't need to detail. If there's anyone who can get Donghyun on a call with me before midnight, it's her. Do you have her number? Not a current one. We haven't spoken in 4 years. 4 years, Amara said. Something passed between them in the repetition of that number. Neither of them named it. Her name is Kang Ji-yeon, he said. She runs a design firm in Busan. The firm's public. Amara picked up her phone. She found the firm in 4 minutes. The contact form. The public booking email. She wrote the message in English and asked Min-jae to translate it, which he did, standing over her shoulder at the kitchen counter, his voice low and precise as he rendered her words into Korean, and she typed them. Urgent, family matter. Min-jae needs to reach Donghyun before midnight. Call this number, please. She hit send, then they waited. Min-jae stood at the kitchen window. She moved around the space, doing the small tasks she always did because motion was the thing she had. The one tool that never failed her. Wiping the counter, organizing the spice shelf that didn't need organizing, finding 3 things to put in their correct places. She was aware of him tracking her peripherally without appearing to track her. She was aware of him, as she was always aware of him when he was in the same room, with the specific full-body awareness she had managed for 4 years and was no longer attempting to manage. At 11:15 in the morning, her phone rang. She answered it and handed it to him without speaking. He took it and walked into the corridor. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the cadence of the call without the words, Korean, rapid, low, with a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Something that was not professional and not organizational. Something that was almost young. The voice of a man talking to someone who knew him before he became what he was. She listened to the shape of it and looked out at Zuri in the garden and waited. He came back 12 minutes later. She'll try, he said. Try. Donghyun doesn't take calls from numbers he doesn't recognize. She has to get to him in person. She's 3 hours from where she thinks he is. He looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. We have until midnight. 9 hours. 3 hours for Ji-yeon to reach Donghyun. Whatever time it took to convince him to make a call. Whatever time it took for Min-jae to close the argument. The margin was there. Barely. The kind of barely that only existed mathematically. Min-jae looked at her. I need you to understand something, he said. I'm listening. If Donghyun doesn't vote with us tonight, if the council invalidates the documentation, it doesn't end there. I still have options, legal options, outside the family structure, public documentation that the council can't touch. He held her gaze. It takes longer. It's more complicated. But there is no version of this where I allow what happened 22 years ago. She looked at him. You know what that commitment cost you, she said. Not a question. A test. I know exactly what it costs, he said. I'm telling you anyway. She nodded once. Slow. She believed him. She wasn't certain that was comfort. At 2 in the afternoon, Seoa came downstairs with a bag. Not luggage, not the 12 matching pieces. A single overnight bag carried herself without staff assistance, which told Amara everything about the intent before Seoa said a word. She found Amara in the corridor near the east sitting room and stopped. I'm going to stay with a friend tonight, she said. I'll be back tomorrow. Okay, Amara said. Seoa looked at her, then doing something that appeared to cost her a specific expenditure of energy. Is there news? Min-jae's working on it. A nod. Then, almost below audibility, I hope it works. She walked toward the main entrance. Amara stood in the corridor and watched her go and thought about the laundry room. The flat, terrible honesty of it. The word relocation delivered in a voice built for composure. The 22 years someone else had spent with a different picture. She thought about this fact that Seo-ah, who had every reason to want this complicated and unresolvable, had just said she hoped it worked. She filed this also. Ji-yeon called back at 6:47 in the evening. Amara was with Zuri doing bath time. The specific chaos of a 4-year-old who had opinions about every stage of the process. who narrated her own bathing as if providing live commentary, who regarded shampoo as a negotiation rather than a procedure. Amara was kneeling on the bathroom tile, sleeves pushed up, her hair damp at the temples, fully occupied, when she heard Minjae's footsteps change quality in the corridor outside. Fast. Purposeful. The footsteps of a man moving towards something. She got Zuri out of the tub and into her towel, and her pajamas, and her rabbit, and settled with a picture book in her room, and then she went into the corridor. Minjae was coming from his study. His face was... She didn't have a word for it immediately. It was the face of a man who had received information that had shifted the ground under him, and who was still standing, but differently than before. Jiyeon reached him, he said. He agreed to call. She exhaled. And? He's not voting for ratification. She went very still. He's not voting for ratification, she repeated. After Jiyeon, it's not about Zuri. It's not even about me. His voice was controlled, but the control was working hard. Donghyun is using the council vote as leverage for his own dispute with Byung-soo. He's been abstaining for 3 years, and now he has something both sides want, and He stopped, jaw set. He's negotiating. He's using my daughter as a bargaining chip. Yes. The word landed in the corridor between them. Amara stood with it. 4 years of her life, the savings account, the backup plans, the years of making herself small and invisible and useful and undemanding, the years of telling herself that the infrastructure she'd built would hold, that she was prepared, that she had done everything right. The man's face at 8 o'clock last night with the word relocation. The woman on the phone with 22 years of a different picture. And now a man in a hotel somewhere using midnight as a leverage point in a dispute that had nothing to do with her daughter and everything to do with what her daughter had become. A variable. A piece on a board she had never been shown. She pressed one hand flat against the wall. Breathed. How much time? She said. 5 hours. What does Donghyun want? A concession from Byung-soo on a financial matter that predates all of this by 3 years. It's not something I control directly. I'm not the one he's negotiating with. Can you get to Byung-soo? Byung-soo will not make a concession under this kind of pressure. He'll recognize it as a structural precedent. If Donghyun can leverage a council vote once, it becomes a mechanism. He won't allow that. He paused. And he knows Donghyun knows it. This isn't actually a negotiation. It's Donghyun telling me he won't save me tonight and dressing it in a condition he knows can't be met. Amara looked at him. She saw it on his face, the full picture of it, finally, with nothing managed or filtered. He had worked the phones for 18 hours. He had 3 votes. The 4th was using the midnight window as a personal weapon in a war that predated Zuri's existence. The documentation would be invalidated. The council would recommend the traditional solution. And Minjae, who had told her with complete honesty that there was no version of this where he allowed what happened 22 years ago, was standing in his own corridor at 6:50 in the evening, looking at the specific shape of a fight he had not yet found the door out of. She pushed off from the wall. I'm calling Donghyun, she said. Amara, not through Jiyeon, directly. Give me the number he called from. That's not... Give me the number. He looked at her for a long moment. The calculation, she could see it running, the same calculation he ran on everything, assessing, weighing. And then something in his face shifted. Not defeat, something closer to the specific exhaustion of a man who has tried every door in his framework and is now watching someone try the wall. He held out his phone. She looked at the number on the screen. She saved it to her own phone. She walked to the east sitting room and closed the door. She called Donghyun. He answered on the 3rd ring, which surprised her. She had expected the buffer of an assistant, a manager, someone between him and an unknown number. But he answered directly, and his voice was careful and evaluating in a way that told her he had known this call might come. Mr. Kang, she said, in English, which she knew he spoke. My name is Amara Johnson, Zuri's mother. A pause. I'm aware of who you are, he said. Then you know what I'm going to say. I have a good idea. I'm not going to appeal to your conscience, she said. I don't know you, and I have no basis to know what kind of man you are. I'm going to tell you one thing, and I'd like you to think about it. He was quiet, listening. Your cousin Jiyeon left this family 6 years ago because of something Byung-soo did, she said. I don't know what it was. I don't need to. But I know what it costs to leave and stay gone, And I know that Ji-yeon drove 3 hours today to find you and ask you to make a phone call for a 4-year-old girl she has never met. She paused. Let it sit. I'm asking you to consider what that cost her. And to ask yourself whether the thing you're using tonight as leverage is worth what she spent today to ask you not to. Silence. The sitting room was very still. You're not appealing to my conscience, Dong-hyun said. I told you I wasn't. That is precisely an appeal to my conscience. I know, she said. Another silence. Longer. She held the phone and breathed and did not fill the silence. And then she heard from upstairs, through the ceiling, through the floor above, through all the structure of the house, the small specific sound of her daughter's voice reading out loud to herself from her picture book, the way Zuri always read, narrating confidently whether or not she had the words right, inventing the parts she didn't know, certain of her own story's direction even when the actual text went somewhere she hadn't yet learned to follow. She heard it through the ceiling, and she didn't look away from the middle distance, and she didn't say another word. She let Zuri's voice do what no argument could do. Dong-hyun was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, I'll make the call. The line went dead. She sat in the east sitting room for 2 minutes after the call ended, not processing, not planning, just sitting with the specific physical weight of a thing that had been held at maximum tension and had just, possibly, shifted 1 degree. The relief wasn't clean. It couldn't be clean yet, not with 5 hours left on the clock, not with 3 votes still needing to become 4 in a council room she had no access to. But something in her chest unclenched by exactly 1 notch, and she let herself feel that 1 notch before she stood up. She opened the door. Minji was in the corridor. He hadn't moved far, maybe 10 feet from the sitting room door, standing with his phone in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who had been listening to silence and trying to read it. She looked at him. He said he'll call, she said. Something moved through Min-jae's face. Fast, controlled, gone. But she'd seen it. She was getting better at seeing the things he moved through fast. He nodded once. Then his phone rang. He took the call in his study. She went upstairs to Zuri. The picture book had been abandoned in favor of a more ambitious project. Zuri had found a piece of paper and a red marker and was drawing what appeared to be a map. An extremely detailed map of a garden with 8 circles along one edge that were clearly the pebbles, and a larger circle in the center that Zuri identified, without looking up, as the thing we're going to plant. What are we going to plant? Amar asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Something tall, Zuri said. He said I could pick. He said that. In the garden, yesterday. She added another pebble to the border, tongue between her teeth with concentration. I want something that gets tall, so I can see it from the window. Amara sat on the edge of her daughter's bed in the orange nightlight and watched her draw her garden. She thought, whatever happens in the next 5 hours, this is what I'm holding on to. This map, this red marker, this specific child who has already decided what she's planting and is drawing the map before the ground is even ready. She thought, she gets that from me. She thought, she gets the certainty from him. She sat with her daughter until Zuri's eyes started losing the battle with sleep, the marker going slower, the lines getting less deliberate. She tucked her in and took the marker and set it on the desk and turned off the lamp, leaving only the nightlight. She stood in the doorway. Mama, Zuri said, mostly asleep. Yeah. Will the man be here in the spring? Amara held the door frame. I don't know yet, baby. I want him to be here, Zuri said, for the planting. She closed the door. She stood in the dark corridor and pressed her back against the wall and tilted her head up and breathed through the thing that was happening in her chest. Not crying. She didn't have room for crying, but the pressure of it, the full accumulated pressure of 4 days and 4 years, and the map on the desk, and the 8 pebbles, and the spring that hadn't happened yet, and the man downstairs on the phone trying to hold a world together with 3 votes and a timeline. She breathed. Then she went downstairs. Minji came out of his study at 9:47. She was in the kitchen, not doing anything useful, just there, in the kitchen, because it was where she could be without the house feeling like it was pressing on her from all sides. She had made actual tea this time, had drunk half of it. The rest was cold in the cup. He came into the kitchen and stood across the counter from her, and she looked at his face and tried to read it. Dong-hyun called the council chair at 8:30, he said. Byung-soo, his deputy. He has a deputy chair who manages procedural matters. Dong-hyun invoked his voting right and registered his position. He paused. One beat. He's voting for ratification. The kitchen was very quiet. So 4 votes, she said. 4 votes. Majority. The documentation stands. She set down the cold tea. She didn't cry. She had thought maybe she would cry when the number reached 4, but what she actually felt was something more like the specific physical sensation of a structure that has been under load for a very long time being allowed to bear its own weight again. Not lightness. Weight redistributed to its proper load-bearing points. It's not over, he said. Byung-soo has 48 hours to file a procedural challenge. He will file it. It extends the timeline, but it doesn't overturn the vote. He'll keep fighting. Yes. But on ground that favors me. He held her gaze. My lawyers are better than his lawyers, and I have 4 votes on record. The challenge will be managed. How long? Months, probably. Not tonight. Tonight it's done. He paused. Zuri's documentation is valid. She's formally acknowledged. Nobody is relocating anyone. The last sentence was flat and final, and she understood that it was meant to close that particular door completely. Not just for tonight, not just procedurally, but as a statement of what he was prepared to do to keep it closed indefinitely. She looked at him across the kitchen counter. This man she had met in a hotel bar in Chicago when she was 27, and he was using a different name, who had smiled at her daughter in a corridor and not known why, who had sat in a winter garden with 8 smooth pebbles in his palm, who had spent 18 hours on a phone working 3 votes toward 4, while she stood in a laundry room and a linen storage and a sitting room and tried to hold herself together without the full picture. You should have told me, she said again. Not angry anymore. Just true. I know, he said. Not just the timeline, everything. From the beginning of this, the council, the structure, Byung-soo, the precedent, you should have told me. You're right. I needed the full picture. I am her mother. I needed... You're right, he said again. And then, doing the thing she had noticed he did rarely, the thing that cost him specifically, because he was a man who had spent his entire adult life being certain. I defaulted to managing it. It's what I know how to do. It's not... He stopped, jaw tight. It wasn't the right instinct. Not with you. Not with this. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, She's drawing a garden map. He blinked. The shift in subject. He adjusted. What kind of map? Very detailed. The pebbles are all there. There's a circle in the middle for whatever she decides to plant. A pause. She wants something tall, so she can see it from the window. Something happened in his face. Not the fast-controlled thing. Something slower. Something that didn't try to leave. She said she wants you here in the spring, Amara said. For the planting. The kitchen was quiet. Tell her I'll be here, he said. She nodded. She picked up the cold tea and poured it down the sink and rinsed the cup. She thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow the 48 hours starts, and Byung-soo files his challenge, and the months of legal management begin, and there will be more nights like this, more timelines, more structures she doesn't fully understand operating around her daughter's life, with their own logic, and their own history, and their own violence. She thought, I knew that when I stayed. She thought, I knew it when I answered the first call from the unknown Korean number and listened, instead of hanging up. She turned off the kitchen tap. She was reaching for the dish towel when the front door opened. Not the service entrance, the main door. She heard it from the kitchen, the specific sound of the main entrance, heavier than any interior door, and the cold air that moved through the house when it opened even at this distance. She stood still. Mrs. Park had gone home at 8. The guards at the main entrance should have, controlled access. She heard Min Jae's voice from the corridor, sharp, Korean, too fast to catch, and then another voice, male, older, with a quality in it she recognized from 2 nights ago. She walked to the kitchen door. Byung-soo was standing in the main corridor. He had not waited 48 hours. He had not filed a procedural challenge. He had come personally, at 9:57 in the evening, in his overcoat, without an appointment, through a gate that had been opened for him by guards, whose loyalty, Amara understood in this moment with absolute clarity, was not entirely to the man she had believed it was entirely to. He had 2 men with him, the same 2 from before. Min Jae was between Byung-soo and the staircase. The physical geometry of it was not accidental. Min-jae had positioned himself, or had found himself, in the 10 seconds between the door opening and this moment, between the older man and the floor above, between Byung-soo and the room at the top of the stairs where a 4-year-old girl was sleeping with a map of her spring garden on the desk beside her. The vote was registered, Min-jae said. His voice was very quiet. The documentation is valid. The documentation is pending challenge, Byung-soo said, which I am here to file. The challenge window is 48 hours. You have 48. I'm exercising an emergency provision. Byung-soo reached into his coat and produced a folded document, set it on the side table without looking at it. Article 9 of the Family Charter. Emergency dissolution of an acknowledgement where the acknowledged party represents a material security risk to the organization. Min-jae didn't look at the document. She's 4 years old, he said. The acknowledged party's existence creates public exposure in a regulatory environment that is currently, she's 4 years old. The provision does not have an age qualifier. The two men in the corridor had not moved, but Amara noticed, and she was watching with the complete focused attention she had, that they had shifted their weight, both of them. Subtly, in the direction of the staircase rather than the door, she noticed something else. The guard who had let them in, standing now just inside the main entrance behind Byung-soo's men, was not one of the faces she had catalogued over 4 years of this household, not one of Min-jae's regular security rotation. A different face. Someone who had been here long enough to open the gate, but not long enough for her to have learned him. She filed this. She took a step back into the kitchen doorway, out of the corridor's sightline, and took out her phone. She sent one message. To the number she had called an hour ago, she typed, "He's here. Main house. Article 9. Now." She put the phone back in her pocket. She walked back into the corridor. Byung-soo saw her. He looked at her with the message look, not the assessment from before. Colder. The look of a man who has arrived at the point in his calculation where the variables stop being variables and become objects to be moved. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "I'd like to speak with my nephew alone." "This is my house," Min-jae said, "and your daughter is upstairs. I'd suggest, don't." Min-jae's voice dropped to something that was almost below audible, which was somehow the most dangerous thing Amara had heard in this corridor in 4 days. "Don't reference her. Don't look in that direction. Don't." Byung-soo looked at him. "Min-jae." The older man's voice changed quality. Not warmer, but different. Older. The voice of a man who has known someone since their childhood and is invoking that history. "I watched you grow up. I watched your father build what you now run. I am not your enemy. I am trying to protect what your father spent his life." "My father is dead," Min-jae said. "He left me what he built, not you. He left you a council. He left me a responsibility. The council serves the organization, not the other way around." He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved, but something in the air of the corridor had changed, the same way the air in a room changes when a storm is deciding whether to break. "You are in my house past 10 at night, with a document you produced in 3 hours using a provision that has been invoked exactly once in 40 years to file an emergency action against a 4-year-old girl. I want you to hear yourself, Byung-soo. I want you to stand in this corridor and listen to what you are doing." Byung-soo's jaw was set. "What I'm doing," he said carefully, "is protecting this family from a decision made in emotion rather than strategy. The girl's existence doesn't need to be..." He paused, choosing words. "It doesn't need to be publicly erased. She can be provided for, comfortably, privately. It's been done before, and I know it's been done before." Min-jae's voice shifted. Something in it that hadn't been there in any version of this conversation over the past 4 days. Raw at the edge of the control. "I know exactly when and how it was done before. And I know who made that decision and what it cost, and I am telling you, with complete clarity, so there is no ambiguity about what I mean, that it will not happen again. Not in this house. Not to this child. Not while I'm standing in this corridor." Amara was watching Byung-soo's face. She saw the moment he decided that conversation had reached its limit. It was very small, a fractional shift in his expression, a loosening of the words around his mouth, a look that moved briefly to his men and then back, so fast that if she hadn't been watching for exactly this, she would have missed it. She moved, not toward Byung-soo, not toward his men, toward the staircase. She took the stairs fast, not running, because running would be noise, and she didn't know yet what the next 60 seconds looked like, and she needed to know before she made it louder. Fast and quiet on the marble, her hand on the banister, up to the second floor, down the corridor to Zuri's door. She opened it. Orange nightlight, rabbit underarm, small face slack with deep sleep. She went in and closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it and tried to do the math. The corridor below, Min-jae's voice she could still hear as a murmur through the floor. The two men's weight shift toward the staircase. The guard at the entrance who was not a face she knew. Her phone buzzed. Ji-yeon. I called my father. He's calling Shin-woo. Hold on. She didn't know who Shin-woo was. She texted back, Who is Shin-woo? Ji-yeon, council security chair. He outranks Byung-soo on enforcement. If he calls the action unauthorized, Byung-soo has to stand down. Hold on. She put her phone in her pocket. She looked at her daughter. Zuri had not stirred. Completely under, in the absolute sleep of a child whose body has decided the day is over and will not be argued with. One hand on the pillow, the map on the desk, the red marker beside it. Amara stood at the door and listened to the house. Below, the murmur of voices continued. Not escalating. Not yet. The conversation still in its contained form. Two men who knew each other across decades of shared history, moving through the architecture of a confrontation neither of them had expected to be having at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. She counted her own heartbeats. Got to 27 before her phone buzzed again. Ji-yeon. Shin-woo is calling Byung-soo now. She exhaled, held the door handle. From below, she heard Byung-soo's voice change quality. She couldn't hear the words, just the shift in register, the specific compression of a man receiving information that alters the geometry of his position. Then silence. Then footsteps. Not toward the staircase, toward the main entrance. She heard the door, cold air. Then nothing. She waited. 60 seconds. Then Min-jae's footsteps on the stairs. Not fast. Not the purposeful velocity of a man moving toward something. Slower. The footsteps of a man who has been standing under maximum load for 4 days and has just, in this moment, been allowed to put some of it down. He stopped outside the door. She opened it before he could knock. He looked at her. Then he looked past her at Zuri, at the nightlight and the rabbit and the map on the desk. She's asleep, Amara said quietly. He nodded. He looked at the map on the desk for a moment. Those red marker circles, the 8 pebbles along the border. The tall thing in the center that hadn't been decided yet. The guard at the entrance, he said quietly. The one who let him in. He's not one of yours. No. His jaw set. Byung-soo has been placing people in the rotation for 2 years. I knew about some of them, not that one. He paused. I'll handle it. Tonight? Tonight. She looked at him. Min-jae, quiet. You need to sleep. He looked at her. Something in his face said the exhaustion of it, the full 4 days of it finally visible on the surface because there was nothing left requiring the wall to stay up, moved through her chest in a way she didn't try to categorize. The challenge, he said. Byung-soo backed down tonight because Shin-woo called it unauthorized, but he'll file the 48-hour version tomorrow. It's still months of process. I know. It's not clean yet. I know. She looked at him steadily. But she's asleep. She drew her garden. She asked if you'd be here in the spring. She paused. Tonight is enough. Tonight we did enough. He held her gaze. She could see him running the calculation. The instinct to move, to plan the next step, to stay 3 moves ahead of the problem, the deeply ingrained operational reflex that didn't know how to accept enough as a condition. She watched him fight it. She watched him, very slowly, lose to it in the best possible way. He leaned against the doorframe, both of them looking in at the orange nightlight and the sleeping child and the map on the desk. Sunflowers, he said quietly. She looked at him. For the garden. Something tall. She should plant sunflowers. He kept his eyes on his daughter. They get tall enough to see from a second-floor window if you plant them right. They come up fast. She won't have to wait long. Amara looked at the map, looked at her daughter, looked at the man in the doorframe who had spent 4 days learning how to fight for something he'd never known he had, was his. She said, Then we'll plant sunflowers. Friday came in gray and cold. The way Seoul comes in January when the city has used up its quota of dramatic weather and settles into the long administrative winter. No snow, no sharp light, just a flat pewter sky that commits to nothing. Amara was up before 6. Not because she'd slept badly, which would have been the expected thing. She'd slept deeply, the sleep of someone whose body had finally been permitted to spend what 4 days of sustained tension had cost. She woke because she always woke before 6, because 4 years of running a household had installed the habit below the level of decision. She lay still for a moment before getting up. Listened to the house. The house was quiet in its ordinary way. The specific silence of a large structure in early morning, full of its own temperature and its own settled weight. Not the held silence of the past 4 days. Something older than that. Just the house being a house. She got up. She made coffee in this kitchen before anyone else was moving. Stood at the window with the mug and looked at the garden. The 8 pebbles were still in their line along the stone border. A skin of frost on the dead grass, thin and white in the early flat light, the kind of frost that would be gone by 9. She thought about sunflowers. She had never grown anything. Chicago apartments didn't lend themselves to gardens, and the 4 years in this house had been spent tending someone else's space with professional care rather than the particular attention you give to a thing that's yours. But she knew that sunflowers grew fast. She knew they were difficult to kill once they were going. She knew, from somewhere, some accumulated knowledge she hadn't cataloged, that they tracked the light, that they turned toward whatever brightness was available and followed it through the day. She thought, Zuri would like knowing that. She thought, I would have liked knowing that at 4. She drank her coffee. Minjae came downstairs at 7. He looked like a man who had slept 2 hours and had made peace with 2 hours being what was available. Not wrecked, he didn't wreck easily, she had established this over 4 years, but the specific texture of someone operating on the lean side of their reserves and doing it with full awareness and without complaint. He poured coffee without speaking. They stood at opposite ends of the kitchen counter for a moment, both looking out the window, the morning gray and quiet between them. The guard, she said, reassigned last night, off the property. He drank. I went through the full rotation. 3 others I'm less certain about. They'll be rotated out over the next week without incident. Byung-soo will replace them. He'll try. He set the mug down. I've changed the access authorization protocol. Anyone new comes through my personal approval. It's a slower system, but it closes the channel he was using. She nodded. The challenge, she said, the 48-hour filing. His lawyers submitted it at 7 this morning. My lawyers filed the response at 7:15. He looked at her directly. It's going to be months of procedural management. There will be hearings. There will be pressure from other council members who prefer stability over conflict. None of it is clean. He paused. But Zuri's documentation is on record, and it's valid, and it stays valid through all of it. That doesn't change. She looked at him. You need to tell me things, she said. Going forward, whatever's happening in that structure that touches her life, I need to know about it when you know about it. Not managed, not filtered. She held his gaze. I can handle the real thing. What I can't handle is operating on half the picture. I know, he said. I understand that now. Do you? Yes. And then doing the thing that still seemed to cost him specifically. I was wrong to manage you out of it. I won't do it again. She believed him. Not completely. She was not a woman who gave complete belief easily, and she had earned that particular caution. But enough. Enough to work with. She picked up her coffee. She's going to ask about the sunflowers, she said. Something shifted in his face. The small shift, the one she was learning to read. The one that meant something had reached a place past the operational layer. When? This morning, probably. She knows what she wants. She doesn't wait. She looked at the garden. We should have a plan before she wakes up. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know anything about planting sunflowers, he said. Neither do I. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, for the first time in 4 days, in 4 years possibly, in this specific configuration of the two of them standing in the same room with nothing left to manage, something almost like humor crossed his face. Not the social version, something older and tireder and more honest than that. We can learn, he said. Yes, she said. We can. Right. Zuri woke up at 7:43 and arrived in the kitchen with her rabbit and her map and immediate questions. She spread the map on the kitchen table and pointed at the large circle in the center with the authority of someone presenting architectural plans. "This is where it goes," she said. "The tall thing." Minjae was still at the counter. He turned and Amara watched him look at his daughter with the map, watched him take in the red marker circles and the 8 labeled pebbles and the tall thing in the center, and watched his face do the slow thing rather than the fast thing. He crossed to the table and crouched down. "Sunflowers," he said. Zuri looked at him. "What's sunflowers?" "Tall flowers, yellow. They can get—" He held his hand at approximately his own standing height. "Taller than me if you grow them right." Zuri's eyes went very large. "Taller than you?" "Some of them." She looked at the map, then at her circle. She picked up the red marker and with very deliberate effort added lines coming out of the circle. Rays, Amara realized. She was drawing a sun, or a sunflower. Both. "Okay," Zuri said. "Sunflowers." Then she looked up at Minjae with the directness that 4-year-olds apply to important matters. "Do you know how to plant them?" "No," he said. "Mama knows." "No," Amara said. Zuri looked between them with the mildly exasperated expression of a child surrounded by adults who are consistently failing to have the information she needs. "Then we have to learn," she said, and returned to her map. Minjae looked at Amara over the top of Zuri's bent head. She kept her face composed, but her eyes said, "I told you." The call from Byung-soo came at noon, not to Minjae's phone, to the estate's main line, which routed through the household management system that Amara had administered for 4 years. She picked up at the kitchen extension because she was standing next to it when it rang, and because she had decided, somewhere between 6 and 7 this morning, that she was done arranging herself out of the way of things that concerned her daughter's life. "Ms. Johnson," Byung-soo said. "Mr. Kang," she said. A pause. He had not expected her to answer. She had not expected to feel the satisfaction she felt at his not expecting it, but she felt it, and she let herself feel it without guilt. "I'd like to speak with my nephew," he said. "He's unavailable at the moment." Minjae was in his study. She had not checked whether he was on a call or not. It didn't matter. "Can I take a message?" Another pause. Longer. "I want you to understand something," he said. His voice was careful, controlled. The voice of a man who has spent decades saying difficult things in pleasant registers. "What I did last night, what I am doing, is not personal toward you or toward the child. I want you to understand that." She held the phone. She thought about this woman who had called her from an unknown number. 22 years of a different picture. The flat, terrible delivery of the word relocation. The settlement, the managed discretion. "I understand exactly what it is," she said. "And I want you to understand something in return." She kept her voice even. Completely, deliberately even. "The documentation is on record. The vote is on record. Your challenge is on record, and my partner's lawyers filed their response at 7:15 this morning. All of it is on record, and none of it goes away." She paused one beat. "If you file another emergency provision, or introduce another unauthorized action in this house, or place another person in this security rotation without my partner's authorization, I will make sure that the precedent from 22 years ago becomes part of the public record as well. The name of the child, the name of the mother, what was paid and by whom and under whose authorization. I have her number. She gave it to me." Another pause. Measured. "I want to be clear that this is not a threat in the conventional sense. It's an accounting of the available information and what I'm prepared to do with it. You may pass that along to whoever needs to hear it." The line was silent. She could hear him breathing. She waited. "You've been in this house 4 years," he said finally. "Yes." "You've learned quite a lot." "Yes." Another silence. Then he said, with something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not warmth, not respect exactly, but the specific quality of a man reassessing a variable that has declined to remain a variable. "I'll tell my lawyers to expect a long process." "That's fine," she said. "We have time." She hung up. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her hand still on the phone. Then she went to Minjae's study and knocked. "Come in." She opened the door. He was at his desk, phone down, looking at a document. He looked up. Byung-soo called the main line, she said. He put the document down. What did he say? I told him about the woman from 22 years ago, that I had her number, that her name and the details of the settlement were available for public record if he filed another unauthorized action. Min-jae was completely still. You had that conversation, he said. Yes. A long moment. He'll verify whether you actually have the information, he said. I know I do actually have it. She called me voluntarily and she gave me her number and she is, I think, done with 22 years of managed discretion. She held his gaze. I didn't do it to undermine your legal strategy. I did it because it was the available move and it needed to be made and I was standing next to the phone. He looked at her. She waited for the assessment, for the calculation, for some version of the managed response. Instead, he said quietly, Good. She nodded once. She turned to go. Amara? She stopped. Stay, he said. Not a command, not the corridor version from 4 days ago, that employer reflex. Something else. Just the word, plain, with its actual meaning under it. She turned back. She crossed to the chair across from his desk and sat down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the window. Outside, the pewter sky. The garden below. The faint outline of 8 pebbles along the stone border, the frost long burned off by now. I want to tell you about my father, he said. She waited. He built what I run, 30 years, started with almost nothing and built it through the things that build organizations like this. Not clean, not ever clean. He kept his eyes on the window. He was not a good man in the conventional sense. He made decisions I understand now as an adult who runs what he built that I couldn't have understood at 8 or 12 or even 20. He paused. But he was my father, and there was a version of him at 2 a.m. in the kitchen, eating cold rice with a spoon because he couldn't sleep. That was just a man who carried too much and didn't know how to put it down. She was very still. I learned the kitchen from him, he said. She didn't say anything. He would have fought Byung-soo on this, he said. I know that. He didn't produce the precedent from 22 years ago. That was Byung-soo's design, and my father never knew about it. And if he had, he stopped. I don't know what he would have done. I know what I want to believe he would have done. The distinction matters. Yes, she said quietly. I'm trying to be... He stopped again, looked at the window. A different thing than what this organization usually produces. I don't know if I'm succeeding. I know what I've done to make it run, and I know it's not... He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I'm not asking you to not see that. I'm not asking for a version of this where the past 4 years didn't happen the way they happened, or the past 4 days. I'm just... He held her gaze. I'm asking for the spring. The study was quiet. She looked at this man, the whole of him, all at once, without managing the looking. The face she had catalogued over 4 years of proximity. The 2 a.m. kitchen. The 8 pebbles. The 3 votes he had worked through a sleepless night to become 4. The way he'd crouched in front of a 4-year-old girl in a corridor and waited while she decided whether to take the cufflink back. She thought about Chicago, the hotel bar at 11, the 2 hours of a conversation she had spent the subsequent years folding down into something she could carry without it taking up too much space. She thought about what she'd said to herself in the dark of her room 4 days ago. She wasn't sure she was allowed to want it. She thought, I am done deciding what I'm allowed to want. The spring, she said. And after, his jaw moved, a small tightening, the kind that wasn't distress, the kind that was the opposite of distress, the very specific physical response of a man who has been holding a question at arm's length for longer than he should have and has just been handed the answer. And after, he said. Seoa came back on Saturday afternoon, not with the 12 matching pieces, with the overnight bag still, and a quality about her that was different from the version that had arrived 8 days ago with the ivory luggage and the property assessment eyes. Something settled in her, something that had been through a room she hadn't expected to enter, and had come out the other side changed in ways she hadn't finished mapping. Amara was in the east corridor when she arrived. They looked at each other. How did it go? Seoa said. Not small talk, direct. The documentation stands. Byung-soo filed the formal challenge. It'll be months of legal process, but the foundation is solid. Seoa nodded. Something in her face that was not relief exactly, but the absence of attention that had been structural, as if a load she hadn't known she was distributing had been quietly removed. "I need to speak with Min Jae," she said. "He's in the garden with Zuri." Seo-ah looked toward the rear of the house. Amara could see her processing this, the garden, Min Jae, Zuri, the specific image of it. "I'll wait," Seo-ah said. She didn't wait in the sitting room. She waited in the corridor, standing at the window that looked toward the garden, and Amara left her there and went back to her work and didn't hover. Because Seo-ah was a woman who needed the dignity of unsupervised space, and Amara understood that without needing it explained. 20 minutes later, Min Jae came in from the garden with frost-reddened hands and Zuri riding his left arm with her rabbit, the two of them in the middle of a conversation about whether sunflowers needed to be talked to in order to grow properly. Zuri's position was that they did. Min Jae's position was that he didn't know, but they could test it. He saw Seo-ah in the corridor and stopped. Zuri saw her too, went still in the specific way she went still around this woman. Not fear anymore, after the corridor and the cufflink, but something careful, something that remembered. Seo-ah looked at the child. She reached into her coat pocket. She produced a small object and held it out toward Zuri. It was a gold cufflink. Not the same one, not Min Jae's, not the one from the floor of the corridor that had started all of it. A different one. Similar. The face of it engraved with something simple, something small. Zuri looked at it, then at Seo-ah, doing her risk assessment, that preliminary caution she'd installed since the first morning. Seo-ah waited, not with the impatience of a woman unaccustomed to waiting, with the stillness of someone who had decided something and was prepared to let it take whatever time it needed. Zuri reached out and took it. She turned it in the winter light coming through the corridor window. "Pretty," she said. Seo-ah's face, the composed architectural surface of it, did the thing that Amara had watched it do in fragments over the past 8 days. The crack at one edge, the thing underneath. Except this time she didn't collect it back quickly. She let it sit on the surface for a moment, visible and undefended, before it settled into something quieter. "Yes," Seo-ah said. "Pretty." Zuri held the cufflink against her rabbit's ear as if introducing them. Seo-ah straightened up and looked at Min Jae. "Can we talk?" she said. "Yes," he said. He handed Zuri to Amara. The transfer, easy, natural, already practiced, already its own ordinary gesture, and followed Seo-ah down the corridor toward the sitting room. Amara stood with her daughter and the rabbit and the gold cufflink in the corridor. Zuri was looking at the sitting room door. "Is she sad?" Zuri asked. Amara looked at the closed door. "A little," she said. "She's been sad for a while." About what? She thought about how to answer this in a way that was true and appropriate for 4 years old. "Something she wanted that she found out she couldn't have," she said. "And she's figuring out what to want instead." Zuri considered this with visible seriousness. "That happened to me once," she said. "When?" "I wanted a dog. You said no." Amara looked at her daughter. "That's right. And then I wanted the pebbles instead. And that was better." She looked at the cufflink. "Maybe she'll find a better thing too." Amara pressed her lips together. "Maybe," she said. "Probably," Zuri said with the cheerful certainty of a child for whom the world has generally obliged. She pushed her rabbit at Amara. "Hold this. I need to put the cufflink somewhere safe." She wriggled down and went to find somewhere safe. Bare feet on the marble, the gold cufflink clutched tight, already moving on to the logistics of her life. Amara stood in the corridor holding the rabbit and watching her go. Whoa. The conversation between Min Jae and Seo-ah lasted 40 minutes. Amara didn't ask what was said. She would learn some of it over time, in fragments, the way the truth tends to distribute itself when everyone involved is done performing and starts just living. She would learn that Seo-ah had told him about the doctors, about the 3 months of silence she'd carried, about the grief that had no clean target, and had therefore found a 4-year-old girl in a corridor as its temporary address. She would learn that Min Jae had listened without interrupting, which was something he was not good at but had managed. She would learn that they had said things to each other that were painful and true, and that the pain of them was, ultimately, the kindest thing they could have given each other. What she saw herself was this: Seo-ah coming out of the sitting room with her overnight bag and her composed face, and something in her posture that was different from every version of her posture over the past 8 days. Lighter was not the right word. Cleaner, maybe. The way a person looks when they've set down something they'd been carrying in the wrong grip. She stopped at the front entrance and turned. Amara was at the far end of the corridor. They looked at each other. The legal process, Sewa said. If there's anything I can do. I have family relationships with 2 of the council members Byung-soo relies on. I've been maintaining those relationships for 8 months. A pause. I'd like to maintain them differently, going forward. Amara looked at her. Why? She said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. Sewa was quiet for a moment. Because that woman deserved to keep her child 22 years ago, she said, and I knew about that precedent. I'd known about it for years. It was presented to me when I came into this family's orbit as history, the way things had been managed. I accepted it as history without asking what it cost. Her jaw did the thing. Held. I'd like to be useful differently. Amara nodded. Sewa turned and walked out the main entrance. The cold came in briefly. The door closed. Amara stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to find her daughter. The months that followed were not easy. Nothing about them was easy. Byung-soo's challenge ran for 4 months in organizational proceedings that Min-jae managed with the systematic precision he brought to restructuring criminal networks. Methodically, without drama, one procedural step at a time. Seo-ah, true to her word, quietly realigned 2 of Byung-soo's council relationships in ways that were never announced and never needed to be. Dong-hyun's vote held. The challenge was dismissed in the 3rd month on procedural grounds and then again on substantive grounds in the 4th. And by the time the final ruling came through, Byung-soo's position on the council had been materially weakened by the accumulation of what the process had cost him. It didn't eliminate him. It was not a clean victory. It was the kind of victory that real life produces, which is to say it was partial and expensive and required ongoing maintenance and left scars. But it held. Zuri's documentation held. Spring arrived in Seoul at the end of March, tentative at first. Cold mornings, warm afternoons, the particular quality of light that returns after a long winter with a kind of aggressive optimism, flooding the estate garden with more brightness than the dead grass seemed ready for. Zuri had been asking about the sunflowers since February. They planted them on a Saturday morning in late March. The 3 of them in the garden corner that Zuri had claimed, with a bag of seeds from a nursery that Min-jae had researched with the thoroughness he applied to researching everything, which had resulted in a detailed document about soil preparation and depth and spacing that Amara had read and that Zuri had regarded with polite boredom before asking when they were going to actually put them in the ground. The corner had been prepared. The pebbles had been moved, temporarily, solemnly, each one placed by Zuri into a container for safekeeping, and the bed had been turned and amended. Min-jae had done the physical work of it over 2 mornings, which was not something he had ever done before in his life, and which showed in the specific quality of concentration he brought to it. Amara had watched him from the kitchen window and thought about the 2 a.m. kitchen, the cold rice, the particular privacy of a man doing something ordinary badly and not minding. Now they were all 3 crouched in the dirt. Zuri had a packet of seeds in her fist. How deep? She asked. 1 inch, Min-jae said. She looked at her finger, held it against the ground, made a hole with her index finger at what she judged to be 1 inch, dropped a seed, covered it. She did this 7 times, moving along the bed with the methodical focus she brought to things she considered serious. Each seed its own hole, each hole covered, each spot smoothed with a small palm. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the bed. Now what? She said. Now we wait, Amara said. Zuri looked at her. How long? Couple of weeks before you see anything, a few months before they're tall. Zuri looked at the dirt. Then she looked up at the 2nd floor window, then back at the dirt. She stood up and picked up 2 of the pebbles from the container and placed them back along the border, marking the corners of the bed. I'm going to check every day, she said. Every day might be too much, Min-jae said. They need to grow in their own time. Zuri looked at him with the expression she used when she was considering whether adult logic applied to her situation. I'll check every other day, she offered. That's reasonable, he said. She picked up her rabbit, which had been set on the garden wall to observe proceedings, and tucked it under her arm. Can we have breakfast now? She said. Yes, Amara said. Zuri headed for the house, already transitioning to the next agenda item. The garden filed away under active projects. Min-jae stood up. He was dirty from the planting, hands dark with soil, a smear on his forearm, which was not a condition he had previously presented in Amara's experience, and which looked on him like something she didn't have the exact right word for. Present, maybe. Just present. She stood up beside him. They both looked at the bed for a moment, the 8 pebbles back along the border, the smooth padded earth. Somewhere underneath it, 7 seeds. She'll want to dig them up to check on them, Amara said. I know. We'll need a system for redirecting that impulse. I've been thinking about that. I thought if she had a journal to document the progress, something she could draw in, it might redirect the digging toward the recording. Amara looked at him. She thought about the first night in the corridor, the professional wall, the enormous and careful distance between employer and employee that she had maintained for 4 years as a survival structure. She thought about the way he'd moved across that distance in 4 days. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but with the specific velocity of a man who has finally understood what the distance was costing. That's a good idea, she said. He nodded. Then he looked at his dirty hands and seemed to become aware of them. I need to wash before I touch anything in the house, he said. There's a tap on the side of the service entrance. He looked at her. I know every inch of this house, she said. I know you do, he said. They walked toward the house together in the late March morning, the sun making genuine warmth for the first time since November, and from inside they could hear Zuri telling the rabbit about sunflowers in the specific lecturing register she'd developed, explaining things to the rabbit as she explained everything to the rabbit, with the authority of someone who has recently learned important information and considers it her responsibility to pass it along. He held the door for her. She walked through it. That evening, after Zuri was in bed with her rabbit and her new garden journal, which Minjae had produced from somewhere, a real one, small and hardcover with blank pages, and which Zuri had immediately used to draw a detailed diagram of the seed placement from memory. They sat in the kitchen with the last of the dinner things cleared and the city below the hill running its nighttime current of light. Not in different parts of the kitchen, not with the counter between them, at the table, across from each other, 2 mugs of tea. They talked for 3 hours, not about the council or the documentation or Byung-soo's diminished position or the legal process that was closing down around its own conclusion. Not about the 4 years or Chicago or the intercepted messages or the subordinates who were no longer in any position to intercept anything. They talked about the ordinary things, the real things, the kind of things that 2 people talk about when they have stopped managing the space between them and are instead just in it. He told her about his father's kitchen, the specific brand of rice, how he'd stood at the counter as a child watching a man who frightened boardrooms eat cold food at 2 a.m. because the house was quieter then, and he needed the quiet. She told him about Chicago in January, how the lake went iron gray in winter, how her mother had walked her to school in coats that weren't warm enough and had never once let her see that they weren't warm enough because certain things you protected your child from, and that was one of them. He told her about the photograph in his desk drawer, face down for 4 years. His mother, who had died when he was 11, and who had a smile. He said this looking at the table, not at her. A smile that he had been trying to locate the source of since the first week Zuri was in this house. She said quietly, "He has your eyes." He looked up. "Zuri," she said, "has your eyes? I know I said around the eyes she has mine, but the eyes themselves, the way they sit, that's yours." He held her gaze. She held his. The city ran its lights below the hill. The garden was dark outside the window, the sunflower bed invisible in the night, but there, the seeds in the ground doing whatever seeds do in the first nights after planting, taking in moisture, feeling for warmth, beginning the long, slow work of becoming. She reached across the table, not dramatically, not with announcement, just placed her hand over his where it rested on the table, the way you place your hand on something you are no longer pretending you don't want to touch. He turned his hand over. His fingers closed around hers. They sat like that for a long time, in the kitchen of the house on the hill above Seoul, while their daughter slept upstairs with her rabbit and her garden journal, and outside in the dark earth, 7 seeds waited for the spring to make them into something tall enough to see from a second-floor window. The feared Korean Mafia boss who had sat in a garden with 8 smooth pebbles in his palm. The woman from Chicago who had carried every burden alone for 4 years and had finally, in a corridor with a cufflink on the marble floor, reached the end of carrying it alone. The little girl who had wanted something tall and had simply, without drama, decided that was what she was going to have. The lost years were gone. They didn't come back. That was the true price of all of it, the one that didn't resolve, that sat permanent in the ledger, those 4 years of firsts that belonged to no one now but the past. But the garden was planted, and the spring was real. And in the kitchen above the city, with the lights running below and the night quiet around the house, Kang Min-jae held the hand of the woman he had lost and found and was still, carefully, imperfectly, learning how to keep. And for the first time in a very long time, the house on the hill felt less like a fortress and more like the place where someone's life was actually happening. Outside, in the dark ground, the seeds were already beginning.